Hey there, Gothamites. Brian Ward here with another episode of the Arkham Sessions. With me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City and beyond, Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
That would be me.
That is you. Good evening. So we just want to say this morning, actually, there was a tragedy in Virginia, another shooting. Drea, I know this was important to you. So take it away.
Sure. This show is not a news show. It's certainly not a current event type of show where we talk about some of the issues and debates and things that happen in the news. So I certainly am not intending to have a long discussion about it, but I do want to mention that this is relevant to some of the work that we do. And I have gotten questions. I'm sure many folks in the mental health field have gotten questions. Oftentimes when there's a tragedy like this, especially an unexpected shooting that involves violence, of course, and loss of life, that a lot of times the immediate reaction is, why did this happen? Why wasn't this person reformed, or why weren't they getting the help they needed? And of course, there's often a lot of blame around in terms of the field of mental health, as well as, of course, politics and lack of gun control and issues related to that level of reform. So I just felt the need to say that I don't have the answers. I certainly don't have an explanation or theory about this particular incident, as I often, do not. I did not know the person. I will not claim to be able to predict behavior or discuss the cause of something like this.
Well, I think that's important, because one of the things that I know that people tweet you and email you about, because you've brought this up to me in the past when things like this have happened, is that they expect you to be able to diagnose this person with something. And if there's nothing that you've proven on this show over the past year and a half, it's that it takes more than just a single incident to be able to diagnose anyone with anything. Mm-hmm. And even then, it may not be exact, and it may be a combination of a lot of different diagnoses. You can't tell what's wrong with someone just because they took a gun and shot somebody. And I think that's very important for people to understand, because instinctively they want to attach labels to it.
Right. And oftentimes people will ascribe particular, very specific mental health labels without having the professional expertise, background, credentials, licenses to do so. And unfortunately, I'm awaiting some of that, armchair psychology to happen, where people will be throwing out mental health labels and saying that he should have been on medication, he should have been receiving certain treatments. And, the truth is that we don't know. We simply do not know. And of course, if any single person, whether they were a mental health professional or otherwise, could have predicted this, they would have done something to prevent it. So I hate to see blame go in the direction of the mental health field.
I think it's even more, or it's just as important, actually, Drea, because you're talking about armchair psychologists. I think it's just as bad when you've got news networks bringing on qualified individuals who then start to talk about this individual as if he or she was their personal patient, as if they know more about this person than anyone else, does in the media. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just as bad when someone who should be more careful about how they treat these incidents,
right,
just starts willingly diagnosing people or talking about this or this disorder or that disorder, because it's a great disservice to not only those with the disorder who aren't doing these things, but also to the general public who needs to know more about those disorders.
Right. And I've said this before on the show. I apologize. I'm going to repeat myself that there isn't a single mental health disorder that in and of itself is predictive of violence. That
so again,
a tiny fraction of persons with mental health diagnoses will be homicidal or will act out in violence. So
I think that's important for people to understand, is that even when we're talking about these disorders and even the worst of them, I mean, even the ones that we have said are bad disorders, even if you are diagnosed with those disorders in real life, it doesn't mean you are bound to pick up a gun and shoot people. You know, that's something that needs to be understood.
Right. Thank you for saying that. And, I'm feeling an immense amount of sorrow and sadness for the lives that were lost and for the families that were involved. And I have a huge sense of accountability as well. And I wonder, if others share that. I say that because I work in community mental health, and I work with a number of young individuals who are struggling with some issues related to gang violence, with issues related to being aggressive or being the recipients of aggressive behavior. And so when these news stories come out, I often think about, how did we as a community fail this person? How did the family, the parents, guardians, caregivers fail this person? How did the mental health field fail this person? I certainly am not pointing fingers at a single individual or a group of people. It's a comment about our society and our accountability. And yes, when a person decides to pick up a gun and deliberately attack somebody, the fault is completely theirs. But I want to be mindful that that individual at one time was 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. And where were these opportunities to intervene? And how can we see this as an opportunity to learn from it? And the last thing I want to say about this is, of course, as we do the show, we talk about fictional characters, and I tend to be drawn toward what we call villains, the individuals in the narratives that we talk about who are prone to violence and who engage in antisocial behavior and who are, you could even say, homicidal. And I certainly am not at all assuming that individuals who are violent in that way have mental health illnesses, nor am I assuming, nor do I make any claims that individuals with mental health diagnoses are likely to engage in this kind of, really serious criminal activity, the ones that we often talk about on the show. But what I do try to do is have a conversation about how we can understand behavior better. And that's why I'm open and willing to talk about villains and have those discussions as much as we do on the show.
That's great. And if you have questions or if you are deep in thought about today's tragedy, Drea's not claiming to be an expert on this case, of course, but as always, you can email us. We are at arkhamsessions@gmail.com. Just let us know what you're thinking. You can also go to underthemaskonline.com and email Drea there. And of course, you've got our Twitter handles at bward028, but more importantly, at Arkham Asylum Doc for Drea. Another little piece of sad news last week, actually the day that we put the episode up, for people who thought maybe we missed it, it was actually the day that we put the episode up. Unfortunately, we lost someone else in the Bat family, Ms. Yvonne Craig, who most people would know. Certainly if you listen to this podcast, a lot of people would know her as the Batgirl from Adam West's Batman in 1966. And that was absolutely sad. She led a good long life, but at the same time, you can't help but to feel like we lost her too soon. She was a wonderful person by all accounts. So our hearts and our thoughts are going out to Ms. Craig's family and friends, in addition to those we lost today. I I want to talk a little bit about some good stuff, Drea, because I feel like, this show is not a news show. We're not, trying to bring people down, of course. So let's talk about some uplifting stuff. And I think a great segue into our episode is through an email that we received at arkhamsessions@gmail.com. And that's from Stephen Bello, who had a comment about the Mad Hatter episode that we did last week, the Worry Men.
Yeah.
Stephen was kind enough to say that during the last podcast for the Worry Men, Brian wondered why the Mad Hatter had never created his own dream world to escape from the real world rather than always putting those around him in dreamy, hypnotic states. Well, I thought this was a good opportunity to shine a light on the Batman Adventures and Batman and Robin Adventures comics that were released in tandem with the animated series.
I have several of those issues, actually.
You do indeed. I don't know that I've seen this one in your collection, though, and it answers this particular question that I had. He says that sometimes these books explored other facets to characters that the series didn't get a chance to address. It just so happens that Batman and Robin Adventures number 17, story by Paul Dini, no less, addresses the scenario that Brian brought up, where the Mad Hatter is, in fact, living in his own dream world. And in fact, you will see that this story almost feels like the finale to this character in Batman the Animated Series. So he recommends that we get our hands on the books. The one that he recommends, of course, is Batman and Robin Adventures number 17. So you should go out and check it out. I have not read it, so I would like to, and then maybe even come back at some point and talk a little bit about this possibility that Mad Hatter may escape into his own virtual reality rather than put someone else through it. But
that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very cool. And if you're looking for them, he even says that they've started re-releasing these comics in trade collections. So you can go check that out at Amazon or maybe your local comic shop, which I'm pretty sure I'm going to go and do. This week, we are talking about one of your favorite characters. Drea, at the end of last episode, I gave you the opportunity when I said the word Sideshow. What did you think of?
Well, that's Killer Croc.
No, at first you thought of my face. So you thought of my face. And I'm going to say you're probably right. So this week, we are talking about one of your favorite characters, Killer Croc. Now, we have talked about Killer Croc a couple of different times. We've seen him twice before on the show, sort of. We certainly saw him in his very first appearance, and that was in Vendetta. We also saw him in a second appearance in Almost Got Him. But if you remember that episode, it turns out it wasn't actually Croc. It was Batman disguised as Killer Croc. And I want to talk about that a little bit as we go into this episode. But Drea, for those who don't necessarily remember why you have such an affection for Croc, please enlighten us.
First, I want to say I'm not alone in this obsession. I've met another young woman who actually goes to the same CrossFit gym that I attend. I will not provide her full name, but she also is a Killer Croc fan, and I showed her pictures of my Killer Croc shoes, and she was very pleased to learn that someone else was just as passionate about this character. So there, Brian.
I'm not judging. You can love whom you love, but just for people who don't necessarily know why you have such a deep affection for Croc, because a lot of people, especially if the last bit of interaction we've had with that character was Batman portraying him in disguise in Almost Got Him, you sort of get this oafish, stupid brute of a creature that not a particularly good looking fella, and not necessarily all there in his mental capacity. So but you really like this character.
I do. I mean, it's not so much what this character looks like. It's about his narrative. It's about his story. I tend to be drawn to characters that are misunderstood, that tend to be the underdog, that tend to be overlooked and dismissed, maybe even bullied and targeted because of their quirky ways, because of what they look like, because they don't quite fit in. You know, I think it's that kind of Frankenstein's monster.
Thank you for clarifying that.
I know that. Yeah, I just wanted to be sure to say that correctly. It's the Frankenstein's monster dynamic, right? That they ultimately deep down really do want to fit in. And I think Killer Croc in many ways does try to reach out, does try to have what we would call a normal life, but is often kind of abused by society, kind of taken advantage of. In many ways, he's seen as so vile. He's seen as a threat, and he can't get past that. He can't recover from that. And I think it's a tragic story. There's something very fascinating, I think, and very relatable. I think there's something really relatable about his story. And so whenever we get to talk about him, I like the fact that we can draw upon his history.
Sure.
And this is why the animated series is great, is that we have some of his backstory to go from, and we're able to talk about who he is as a character and what he's been through.
Well, and I want to talk about that for sure, because in the first episode, Vendetta, we got the sense that, it's revealed that he had been part of a carnival sideshow, and that he had probably had quite a horrible life as people stared and gawked at him and pointed, and probably, that sort of story of people probably throwing things or just generally finding him horrific and whatnot. And you could easily see where that environment might turn someone against society and maybe even violent to a degree. The second time that we saw him, it was in Almost Got Him. And again, like I said, it actually turns out that was Batman in disguise. Now, Batman does not give a favorable portrayal to Killer Croc in that episode. In fact, it is very different from the Croc that we met in Vendetta. It is, in fact, a very stupid character. Famously, he thought that his Almost Got Him story should simply be that he almost killed Batman with a rock. That was the extent of his story.
I threw a rock at him.
It was a big rock. Which I believe is a true story. I believe that Batman was recounting a true story of an engagement with Croc. But he is certainly portrayed as a simpleton.
Yeah.
Which makes me want to ask you, what does that say about Batman's, interpretation of Croc?
I think he's like most people. He underestimates him. He sees him as one-dimensional. He just sees him as this dumb, big oaf who's just violent and who's homicidal. I think that Bruce isn't as willing to see past that to try to understand and sympathize with him.
So I have to ask, that doesn't really speak all that kindly to Bruce's character, that he's sort of got this inability to see this character who really may just need a hug, some affection, some sort of hand, out.
Well, as we'll talk about in this episode, he's going to need more than just a hug.
I agree, which is a great segue into this particular episode. And I think that it's important to note that when this episode starts out, we are watching a train, potentially on its way to prison. Now, it's on its way to Levitt's prison. I don't know if you caught that in the newspaper front page, but the front page actually reads, "Fiend to serve time, ruled sane and guilty of crimes, Killer Croc going to Levitt's prison. Now, Levitt's, I'm assuming, is named after Mr. Paul Levitz, who a lot of people would know as a well-known writer and editor at DC Comics. In fact, in the early 2000s, up until like 2008 or 2009, he was even the president of DC Comics. So well after Batman the Animated Series, but I've got to think that Paul Levitz is the man for whom Levitt's prison is named.
And I want to point out that the part of that story that was interesting to me is that he was deemed sane and therefore taken to this higher level of incarceration. In other words, he was not given psychological interventions. He was deemed sane in legal terms. Now, let's remember that insanity are legal terms. They're not psychological mental health terms.
And to be insane is incredibly difficult in all cities but Gotham.
Right. So according to this paper, according to this this headline, he was deemed sane. He was aware of his crime. He was aware that he was violating someone else's human rights when he committed the crime. So that's important to know. This is essentially how this episode opens up.
Which I think is important because that is something that we wouldn't have necessarily jumped on had a newspaper in the animated series not come out and differentiated. You can't possibly tell me, Drea, that the Joker is not aware of his crimes being wrong, and that is a man who clearly is not only responsible for it, he's fully aware of what all of those things mean. I don't think he would fit the legal definition of insanity either, and I'm not sure any of the characters that are in Arkham Asylum for the criminally insane would fit that legal definition. And yet Croc here is being singled out as someone who knew what he was doing and was found to be sane and is not going to Arkham Asylum. Right. Potentially because Arkham, we don't know, may not have the capability of housing Croc, but he is instead being sent to another prison. And I find that interesting, and I find it particularly maybe even sad to a degree that he is being transported via train, and it looks like carnival train. Like he's in a cage. He is visible to the guard, and
he's chained up. I mean, it is partially because he's very strong. He's stronger than humans. He needs to be in these metal chains, but it is all underlining this idea that he is more dangerous than humans. He requires a higher level of lockdown than most humans, that he is somehow singled out as being different. And you're right. I think there is a level of humiliation. There is a level of degradation here with him being sort of at the back of this train without, the proper, I guess, amenities that everyone else that we see on this train
and it
is
does
able
look
to have.
Very carnival trainish. In fact, even the press corps, there's a press corps there going along for the ride to watch this guy be put behind bars. They are watching this as if it's a spectacle. It's not so different today. You'll still find loads of press, filing into a courtroom or watching this person be transported from this to that. But in this particular case, you almost get the sense that Croc has been put back into the carnival lifestyle that he was trying so hard to get away from. I mean, if we remember, he was down by himself in a cave. You had to dive under the water to even get to him. And now he is right back in the public eye, which is not where he wants to be, and it makes him a violent individual.
Oh, wake me if he busts out. That'd be a story.
He breaks out of those chains and ends up on the top of the train where one of those reporters, turns out, is Bruce, disguised. And he makes his way to the top of the train, ends up fighting Croc in a very violent battle. The two of them actually end up falling off the train and falling down into a ravine in this sort of violent crash to the ground. And neither one of them is really has their wits about them. I mean, Batman is straight up unconscious. Croc is stumbling. He is dizzy. Now, in fairness, he was shot with a tranquilizer.
Right.
So that very well could be it, but you can't tell me that crashing to the ground like that doesn't, disorient him more than simply the tranquilizers.
Well, and I'm surprised at a couple of things that they actually show him fall down a gorge. He actually falls down. He slips through, and you see him have impact with the ground. It's kind of, I don't know. I saw that as a little bit violent, and also when he realizes that Batman is unconscious, he picks up a giant rock. And
nearly kills him.
He
almost got him again.
He did. It was so close to hitting him. But like you said, because of the tranquilizer or the effects of the tranquilizer, and because of perhaps a concussion or some injury to his head, he is stumbling, he's disoriented, and he actually misses and doesn't hit Batman with that rock.
So Batman ends up waking up and tracks Croc through the forest. They get to this gorge where Croc ends up pushing over a tree in order to create a bridge for him to get away. Again, he nearly kills Batman by tossing gigantic boulders and rocks from up above down onto the tree. The tree crashes, Batman falls. All of this really just in a way for the writers to get Croc away from Batman for a period of time, because it turns out just over this ridge, basically, Croc finds what should be the most ideal home he will ever find. And that is with a commune of sorts with other fellow Sideshow
Carnies.
Oddities, carnies, Sideshow freaks, if you will.
See his chains? The poor guy. It's okay. We'll take care of you.
It turns out that he was actually brought there after falling into a running river and down a waterfall by a little red-haired boy.
Seal boy.
Little red-haired boy by the name of Billy, who happens to have fins and flippers similar to a seal for hands and feet. He was kind of adorable.
He was like the little hero of the story.
He was the little hero of the story. I'm going to take that. I'm going to chalk it up to good redheaded kid. Much like Sherman.
Yeah.
So, or Sherwood. I think it was Sherwood. So, it was a good showing for Gingers in this episode.
2 for 2.
Unfortunately, this kid puts the rest of his family in danger because he brings Croc back home, and they introduce themselves. You've got a number of folks. You've got Richard, who appears to be something of the ringmaster. He's a hunchback who has quite a taste for Shakespeare.
Oh, judgment, thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason.
You've also got May and June, a couple of Siamese twins, probably acrobats or of some kind. And then you've also got Goliath, who's very clearly the bearded lady. Sorry, I meant the strong man, the with a name like Goliath. Sorry, Goliath, strong man. And this is his home, essentially. They explain that they have saved up $50,000 between them in order to help them live this life where no one will find them. No one ever need come out there. They've not seen a single soul since they moved in, and this appeals to Croc quite nicely.
And without hesitation, they bring him in, they trust him, they feed him, they give him shelter. There's something to say about Now, of course, they've been isolated for some time, but they are not threatened by him. They see this massive beast who looks quite different, but they're not threatened by it. One reason could be, of course, because they've lived their own life in a way that they would understand this.
They get it. They understand.
Yeah. But what's interesting is that whereas most people would be immediately threatened and treat him poorly and treat him as if he were different and attack him, ostracize him, the works, this family, this group of individuals, they take him in, they trust him, they immediately inform him about the money. They're clearly accepting him as a member of the family. They're providing him social support. They put him to work. Like the next day, he's out on the farm. So
he has to agree that as long as he's willing to do the work, he can live there. He's basically got a home with them.
Right.
But I want to talk about Croc here, because here he is presented with, again, the ideal situation. The only thing that is bad about this situation is he knows Batman is somewhere behind him, and he's just basically looking over his shoulder at all times. But you've got this ideal situation for Croc, and yet he seems to have distanced himself from humanity so much that he can't recognize it. He's completely blinded, and he doesn't seem to trust even these people, or he doesn't even seem to understand why they would be allowing him, to come in and he actually takes Goliath's bed. I mean, Goliath gives up his bed. So he seems to have distrust even for fellow Sideshow carnies.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that. The fact that I get that if you're in Gotham City and you're living in a sewer, or you're living, in a pipe somewhere, or a cave somewhere, you might not trust those around you. You may not trust Batman, despite how Sideshow freakish Batman is to a degree. But to be presented with what is appears to be haven for you and your kind, talk about a little bit of the damage that Croc must have in order to not just immediately embrace that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a matter of some social rewiring, if you will, that he's up to this point. Now he's an adult. Up to this point, he's experienced so many adverse events, so many stressful life events that have given him this narrative, this story that unfortunately always ends with he's the target, or he's the one who's left out, or he's the one who's taken advantage of. And he has learned, I must be one step ahead. Like, in order for me to survive, in order for me to be able to get what I want, I have to be a step ahead and manipulate people and threaten others and engage in antisocial behavior, which we've seen him do. Now, you make another great point, which is that he's also aware that Batman is on his trail. So part of this, I think part of what we're seeing is that he's hypervigilant, he's on guard, he's acutely aware that at any moment he will have to defend himself or escape, or, it's that fight or flight thing that while everyone else is incredibly satisfied and they're at the sanctuary and they're happy, he's not. He's awaiting this man to take him away. So I think there's a level of hypervigilance and anxiety. It's like he's in Witness. He's in the Killer Croc Witness.
Yeah.
Film.
He looks just like Harrison Ford.
Yeah.
No, I agree with you. I think that certainly adds an element of discomfort for him. But, and something else that you can't help but to notice is that when he ends up telling his story to the fellow, carnies, if you will, they hear a story that I believe to be true. I mean, absolutely true, even though it is told, basically about the police.
See, I was part of this freak show, same as you. Only they kept me chained like an animal. Day and night. forced me to live in a tank, made me do tricks.
How awful, jerks.
Yeah, they fed me fish heads and stale bread. When I tried to get away, they worked me over pretty good. Put me in chains.
It certainly explains the chains, and it certainly makes them jump onto his side immediately because they know what that feels like. Right. But clearly this isn't a recent story. But part of me, as he was telling that story, absolutely believes that he is thinking back to when he was a young boy in the carnival sideshow.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think there is a story of pain and hurt here, and that he knows that story is tragic. And as you're pointing out, he also has the story of incarceration, the story of being a criminal and being labeled a criminal. And while he did engage in activity and behaviors that would, get him into Arkham or get him into this Levitt's prison, that is another narrative that singles him out as being unworthy of the rights that other people have. And I think that as he tells the story, he's also incredibly aware that they're going to sympathize with him. So unlike the portrayal that Bruce Wayne gives of him in Almost Got Him, Killer Croc's actually very intelligent. He's emotionally intelligent, tuning in to what others will relate to and will understand on an emotional level.
I want to talk about that, though. I want to talk about the fact that, let's just say the story is true to some degree. He now uses this story as a device, as a tool for getting him what he wants. And in this particular case, it's shelter and then hopefully $50,000 that he can run away with. Mm-hmm. What kind of a person goes through those things, those horrific ordeals, and then uses them later to get that sympathy?
I think a lot of it has to do with, well, let's be very clear. He doesn't tell this narrative to just anybody. I think that he tells this narrative to the individuals who would relate to it, who would understand that. And I would even go so far to say, fundamentally, there is a need for him to connect to other people who have had that story. Here is a chance for him to tell his story of trauma, of tragedy, of being treated differently, and being able to experience that connection with others who have had the same experience. At the same time, as you point out, on a more complex level, this is his way of getting what he wants. So yes, I do think that there's a degree of manipulation here, and there's a degree of kind of taking advantage of that emotional connection. But I also think fundamentally there is something else being fulfilled here. There's some deeper emotional need being filled here.
Eventually, Batman does end up showing up, and he actually confronts Goliath about the whereabouts of Croc. And in a brilliant move, actually, Goliath fights back.
He's one of us.
One of us. And I think that's great, because that means that this family is on board with Croc's story. They absolutely believe him. They're looking at a man dressed as a bat in a cape and cowl, and they're not on his side at all. They instead are siding with the man who is physically really this oddity, this creature. And
they're not aware of his criminal history.
Right.
And it's really unfortunate that Killer Croc wasn't present, wasn't able to see this other person, vouch for him and protect him and align with him, because ultimately that's something that he needs. He needs that in his life, but he wasn't there to get that.
Well, except that he was, in that when he does show up, he sees that Goliath is fighting Batman. He actually joins in, and the two of them together end up imprisoning Batman. By the way, we should bring this up because I keep forgetting. In every single episode, Batman ends up captured or tied up to something or chained to something or hanging from something. Batman is awful at not getting caught. We're just going to throw that out there. But here he is in a carnival wagon.
I'm going to reframe that and say he faces challenges and he is incredibly resilient.
So you're saying that Batman allows himself to get himself into these challenges. Yeah.
And like many of us, he gets into trouble and then he perseveres and he gets out of trouble.
I think he likes the trouble. I think he's like, oh, I see a carnival wagon over there. If I could just get them to knock me out and put me in there, I cannot wait to bust out of that thing.
There could be some truth to that.
I have wanted to bust out of a carnival wagon since I was a 9-year-old boy. And he does. He gets that opportunity. He, of course, takes on Croc, and this whole thing ends in a fight, of course, as it always does, but not before Batman convinces, and really, let's face it, it's not even Batman so much as it's Croc that convinces that new family of his that he is not who he says he was.
Yes, let's be clear about this because it's important in that at some point Croc has them all in chains or in cages. He's able to take over this whole thing and get everyone caught.
Something that I do like, though, is the moment that Richard says,
"The evil that men do."
Stuff the Shakespeare. You're lucky you're still around to recite it.
Yikes.
So clearly, when he had the opportunity to kill these people, he didn't. So again, Croc, now I realize we're talking about an animated series here, but Croc has the ability to restrain himself. It makes you wonder when Batman says he's a killer Croc, he's dangerous. It makes you wonder what whoever Croc ended up hurting or whatever it is he did that was so violent. It makes you wonder whether they deserved it, because Croc could have killed these people easily. Croc could have killed Batman easily and didn't. Makes you wonder a little bit. Of course, then he goes off to get a rifle so that he can shoot Batman behind the bars. But that's beside the point. I think you and I both know, in the same way that we knew Batman would get caught and that maybe Batman knew that he would get caught,
right.
Croc knew that he would not be able to just take a shot at Batman through the bars. Batman escapes. The two of them end up fighting, and Billy, again, who ends up being the hero of this episode, shows Batman a way into this building, and Batman gets in, ends up fighting Croc, and the whole thing comes to a rather violent end on the water wheel.
Yeah.
As Croc falls into the water, Batman takes him, and eventually Croc is put back behind bars and into chains. Something that I find to be particularly sad is the moment that Billy asks,
"Why, Croc? Why'd you turn on us like that? We could have helped you. We could have done something."
You said you can be yourself out here, remember? I guess that's what I was doing. Being myself.
Now listen to that, Drea, because there is a sadness in that voice, as if Croc is just now realizing that this is himself. So I almost got the sense that this isn't himself, and he knows that's not himself, right. And he's sad about it.
Right. It's almost as if he is at a level of hopelessness, at a level of lacking enough resources and abilities. And I would even go so far as to say lacking good experiences in his life to realize that he could be better than this. Mm-hmm. But I think it's such almost an intelligent thing to say, that even in a safe situation where I'm accepted, where others are like me, where others trust me, where I can relate to them and they can relate to me, even in those environmental circumstances, I am still the same. I'm still an evil person. Like, I think he's ultimately saying that. And I don't use those words. Like, I don't refer to these characters as evil or good or bad or whatever.
Sure.
But I think that's what he's saying here. And it's in juxtaposition with how they're taking him out of here. He has the full-on Silence of the Lambs mask and the face guard. What would you call that? Mm-hmm. And he's strapped up. He's completely lacking, control, but he's also lacking humanity. So I think that there's something sort of dehumanizing about how he's being treated and how he's been treated.
Sure.
So I think in a way it's him giving into, again, we've seen this in previous episodes. He's giving into the story that people want to see him as, the story that people want to know him as is, I'm an evil person and I deserve to be put away, locked away. And he is on some level giving into that notion.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that the end of this episode is as sad an end that we've seen in quite some time, because Croc in this moment seems to be lost. He doesn't necessarily even seem to understand who he is, and I think that is sad. He's violent, but he is one of those characters that wants to get away from it all. He doesn't want to be in Gotham City, and I almost get the sense that he would take this family's $50,000 and he'd run away, and absolutely he would spend it and he would continue to be violent, but it's because he hates people at this point. He hates society, and he's just basically learned to survive. Mm-hmm. And that involves robbing people, even people who would take you in if you would only do the work. And it's a very sad episode, I think.
I agree. And I think the lack of understanding or the unknown here, really, I think it leaves us with a feeling of the unknown. Like, can someone really reform? The reality of the literature, of the research around reform of prisoners or reform of criminals matches this to some degree, that there are no clear answers about how, what is the best plan? What is the best way for people to reform?
Right.
What is the best way to keep people out of prison? And much of that goes into the work related to desistance studies. So I want to take a moment to talk about desistance studies. And as I said, unfortunately, we don't know a ton of those predictive factors. But what's interesting is that researchers are able to come up with correlates, like relationships between the likelihood of someone engaging in crimes and re-entering the prison or the being incarcerated again, and factors such as factors related to reformation. So what they say, for instance, is that there is this age effect that they call it maturational reform. Mm-hmm. And it's harder to understand, but what they're referring to, what researchers are referring to, is the idea that some people actually grow out of their criminal behavior, that with time, with age, people stop engaging in criminal behavior. And it's almost as if the older they get, the lower the likelihood that they'll have this propensity to engage in crime. Mm-hmm. Now, while we know, like, it's not so much the number, it's not so much age, it's more about developmentally what happens over the course of someone's life, right? Like, as we get older, we do tend to think about the meaning of life. We do tend to think about the value of life. Mm-hmm. Maybe our level of sympathy or empathy for others increases, so we're not as likely to violate other people's human rights and dignities. We also have perhaps an increasing level of kind of social awareness and social involvement. As we get older, we're more likely to have engage in, marriages and unions and partnerships and stuff. And that could be one of the reasons why. Well, as people age, they're less likely to engage in criminal behavior.
Gotcha.
And the other thing we know about getting older is, at least in comparison to young adults, to teens, to even people in their early 30s, that there's the level of self-absorption decreases. And interestingly, there is an increase in sort of level of interest in other people, in concern, if you will, for other people. So that could be one of the reasons why there's this aging out process in terms of criminality reducing over time. And if you think about the average age of prisoners, if you think about the media and the age of folks that we see committing more violent crimes, they don't tend to be in their 50s and 60s and even in their late 40s, right?
Sure.
So I think that literature is consistent with that. In addition to that, some researchers actually claim, look, it's not even about age at all. Age just happens to come along with some of these other more meaningful correlates, such as social bonds, like important social bonds. I mentioned getting married, having children, having a family. That, some researchers believe, is really what makes change. That once you have this connection or this accountable relationship, you're less likely to engage in criminal behavior because the impact of that is not just on you, it's more widespread.
How long do you think Croc would have needed to have stayed with his new family? Now, granted, out there in the middle of nowhere, it's a lot harder to engage in criminal activity outside of maybe just killing these poor people. But how long do you think that he would have needed to establish those bonds before he might sort of age out of crime?
I think for him, it was important to meet this family, if you will, but it's not so much the quantity that there were a number of people that were trusting him. It has to be about the strength and quality of their relationships. And that doesn't happen overnight. I think for Killer Croc, he needed time with them to really experience that connection and trust. And for him, I think it's not words, it's actions. Are they really going to follow through and behave and really have evidence for what they're saying, that sure, this is a sanctuary, we're all safe here, we take care of each other. I think that he needs to experience that. And this really gets into a lot of the variables that relate to how change happens in therapy, that the therapist or psychologist can repeat over and over how, you're going to get better, you're going to change this and that. But a lot of times it's with the experience of change. It's the experience of practicing the new skill or taking chances and risks or having those developing social bonds and relationships in a trusting way. Those things really need to happen. That experiential learning needs to happen for someone to really trust that something is effective.
Gotcha.
And then finally, I have a quote that I want to read this to you from the British Society of Criminology. This is a journal that looks into psychological reform and criminal reform. And this particular article I'm reading from talks about narrative theory. And we referred to this a little bit earlier in this episode, but the idea that that instead of thinking of these other variables like aging out of crime and having social bonds and having social responsibilities, to kind of start to think about the individual level and the characteristics of the individual and have them reflect on their story or their narrative to make better sense of what brought them to their crime and how they will, moving forward, not turn to crime again, but turn to something a little bit more pro-social or helpful. So I want to read this quote to you, and then I want to hear what you think about in terms of Croc.
Okay.
Eventually, the culturally shaped cognitive and linguistic processes that guide the self-telling of life narratives achieve the power to structure perceptual experience, to organize memory, to segment and purpose build the very events of a life. In the end, we become the autobiographical narratives by which we tell about our lives. So our experiences actually shape our future, our choices, our behavior.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So it's the personal autobiographies.
So-
Again, according to narrative theory, one needs to look at the self-narrative, the self-concepts of an individual to understand their behavior.
So in other words, it makes perfect sense for Croc to be violent and to lash out against humanity because of his past and the fact that he feels that he was mistreated and violated in some way. Therefore, it completely validates anything that he chooses to do going forward. And he just keeps telling not only himself that, but other people, anyone
Yes.
who will...
He insists, it's the very end of this episode where this is really cemented. He insists at the end, I told you, or I'm telling you now, I'm an evil person and I will always be an evil person. And even saying that out loud, he's reifying, he's reestablishing, this is my identity, this is the person I am. He's telling his narrative.
Except that he doesn't necessarily believe it. I mean, I think he is coming to believe it, certainly, but that sadness in his voice when he says, I guess that's just what I'm doing.
I think that's what we mean by the shaping of behavior and the prediction. That I think what he's saying is, as much as I don't want to be this person, as much as I am regretful that this is who I turned out to be, the next chance I get, this is the behavior I'll engage in, because this is the story I keep telling myself and this is the story I keep experiencing. It's almost as if it's kind of a vicious cycle, that he is acknowledging that he will engage in this antisocial behavior or violent behavior because that's what he knows.
Wow, it's deep.
It's sad.
It is sad. So is there no hope for him?
There is hope. In terms of the research around narrative theory, there are 3 things that are important to reform. One is that the person or the individual would need an opportunity to make sense of their past. So what does that mean for Killer Croc? That he would have a better understanding of his experiences and not internalize the negativity so much, which is really difficult for him to do. But that's the first thing. The second thing would be for him to find fulfillment in productive behaviors. And I think in this episode, he was starting to get there. He was forming relationships. He was helping out on the farm. He was given a purpose. I think that was going in the right direction. But he got distracted with the money. And of course, he knew that Batman was going to find him eventually. Third thing, feeling in control of your future. I'm not sure that Killer Croc ever really felt that way. I think he attempted to gain control of his future, steal the money, get away from Batman, escape. Like, these are all things that tell us he wanted more control, but ultimately he wasn't going to get that control. So those are 3 really important elements to, in terms of narrative theory, to re-envision or understand the past in a way that can move you forward, and to find a different purpose, to find meaning in your life that's fulfilling and that meets some of these needs that weren't met before.
One would think that an episode like this would be just sort of, take it as it is right there on the surface. But it does seem to have a deepness, a depth to it, a sadness to it. And I think that makes it ripe for a show like ours.
You're right. And this is why I like Killer Croc, and I like the stories that involve Killer Croc, in that in the animated series, it's not just, punching and kicking and Batman saving the day. I don't know anyone who would watch this and come out of it saying like, well, that's a successful story, or the hero the hero was successful in the end. This is a tragic story. And I think that it raises a lot of issues, a lot of questions that we would have around how can we, it's a question that Batman often comes across, is how have I failed this person? How can we better this person's life? In what ways could this have turned out, more hopeful?
Well, we will definitely see Killer Croc again. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with him between now and then. Until then, Drea, where can folks find you online?
I'm on Twitter at Arkham Asylum Doc.
And I am at bword028. You can, of course, email us. We are arkhamsessions@gmail.com. You can also email Drea at underthemaskonline.com. Just go there and, click on the email link. It'll go directly to her. You should absolutely go follow our family, our own family of Sideshow. Maybe not. I was trying to go someplace. Fanboycomics.net. They have taken really great care of us. Those folks absolutely deserve your attention over there. So that is fanboycomics.net. You can follow them on Twitter at fanboycomics. Comics spelled with an X. Until next week, when we have a bullet for Bullock. Maybe it means he's, at a gun range and he's all out of ammo and he's like, hey,
he just needs a bullet.
Hey, you got a bullet? And they're like, yeah, I got or it could just be something much more sinister. We will find out. That will be next week. Until then, I am Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And we are
the Arkham Sessions.